Let's talk about the first country was visited by Jose Rizal, which is Singapore. Singapore is a thriving, clean, and innovative city-state that balances modernity with tradition. It is a symbol of what can be achieved with effective governance, cultural harmony, and sustainable development. In May 1882, Rizal left the Philippines and went to Spain to complete his education in eye surgery. He birded at SS Sarbidora, the Spanish steamer headed to Singapore. He is the only Filipino at the ship. After 5 days of sailing, the Saldivora reached Singapore. Rizal registered at the Hotel de la Paz, and during the 2 days of stopover of Rizal, he spent the majority of his time visiting the botanical garden, which showcased a rich variety of tropical plants. Rizal also visited some of the temples which would have offered him a look into religious and cultural practices. He also went to the statue of Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles. As a founder of a modern Singapore, the statue stood as a symbol of British influence in the region. Rizal's time in Singapore was short but meaningful. His experience in Singapore would later influence his broader reflection on colonialism.
During his travel in Europe, Jose Rizal visited Italy, arriving in Rome on June 27, 1887, exploring the city and its historical sites, and visiting other European cities like Turin, Milan, Venice, and Florence. He spent his first day in Rome exploring the Capitoline, Turpin Rock, Palatine Hill, Roman Forum, Colosseum, Capitoline Museum, and the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore. On June 30, 1887, Rizal met an Italian priest on the railway who treated him like an old friend and whom he considered his father confessor. Rizal met Josephine Bracken in Italy, and the relationship between the two blossomed quickly, but one of Rizal's sisters suspected Josephine was a spy of the Spaniards. After a week in Rome, Rizal prepared to return to the Philippines, having already written to his father that he was coming home.
He arrived in Barcelona, Spain on June 16, 1882. His first impression of the city is unfavorable. He created articles for Diaryong Tagalog which were Amor Patria and Los Pages using the pen name Laong Laan. Rizal studied in University Central de Madrid. Jose finished a medical course that was wanted by his father. Rizal spent time reading and attending reunions organized by Ilustrados and used some spare time for shooting and fencing in the communal gymnasium.
Rizal arrived in Paris in 1883 to study medicine, and later returned to specialize in ophthalmology, working under Dr. Louis de Wecker for 4 months. He also visited hospitals and observed medical procedures, including the Linek Hospital and the La Riverizer Hospital. Rizal was often mistaken for a different nationality, such as Japanese, due to his Asian appearance. He also encountered cultural differences and described his observations in his writings. Living in Paris was expensive, and Rizal found it difficult to maintain his studies and expenses. He eventually moved to Heidelberg, Germany due to the lower cost of living. Rizal spent time exploring Paris, visiting museums, gardens, and other landmarks, including the Jardin d'Acclimatation and the Jardin des Plantes. Rizal met Nelly Bousted, a French Filipina in Paris, in the summer of 1889 and became part of a group that included the Luna Brothers and the Pardo de Tavera.
Jose Rizal left Paris for Germany. He arrived at Heidelberg on February 1886, a famous university known for its romantic surroundings. Rizal stayed in a boarding house together with some students who later found out that Jose Rizal was a good chess player. After a few days, Rizal decided to move to a boarding house close to the University of Heidelberg. He was privileged to work at the eye hospital under the supervision of Dr. Otto Becker. Rizal wrote letter to his sister Maria in Trinidad. In his letter, he described Germany as a country of order and obedience. The German students are affectionate, respectful, modest, and not boastful. Rizal wrote a poem entitled A Los Flores del Heidelberg, or To the Flower of Heidelberg on April 22, 1886, because he was fascinated by the blooming flowers along the Neckar River, which is the light blue flower called Forget-Me-Not, his favorite flower. On July 31, 1886, Rizal wrote his first letter in German to Professor Ferdinand Blumentritt, the noted ethnologist who he longed to meet. Rizal heard that Blumentritt was interested in the Philippine languages. Along with his letter was a book entitled Arithmetic. Blumentritt was impressed by Rizal's letter, and so he sent him 2 books. This marked the beginning of their long and frequent correspondence and their friendship that lasted for life. August 9, 1886, Rizal left Heidelberg and arrived in Leipzig on August 14, 1886. He attended some lectures in the University of Leipzig and befriended Professor Friedrich Ratzel, a famous German historian, and Dr. Hans Meyer, German anthropologist. Rizal translated Schiller's William Tell from German into Tagalog. He also translated Fairy Tale of Hans Christian Andersen. Rizal left Leipzig to course on Dresden on October 29, 1886. At Dresden, Rizal met Dr. Adolf Meyer, the director of Anthropological and Ethnological Museum. Rizal stayed only 2 days in the city. Morning of November 1, Rizal left Dresden by train, reaching Berlin in the evening. Rizal met Dr. Fyodor Jagor, author of Travels in the Philippines, a book Rizal admired for its keen observation of the country. Through Jagor, Rizal was introduced to Dr. Rudolf Virchow, a renowned anthropologist, and his son, Dr. Hans Virchow, a professor of descriptive anatomy. Rizal also worked in the clinic of Dr. Karl Ernest Schwager, a famous German ophthalmologist. Rizal became the first Asian honored as a member of the Anthropological, Ethnological, and Geographical Societies of Berlin. Dr. Virchow recognized Rizal's genius and invited him to give a lecture at the Ethnographic Society of Berlin. During Rizal's stay in Berlin, Noli Me Tangere was initially unable to be published. However, with the help of Maximo Viola, who provided the necessary funds, the novel was finally published. After completing the final touches during the Christmas season, Rizal finished the novel on February 21, 1887. It was printed and released on March 21, 1887.
On February 3, 1888, with a heavy heart, Rizal left Manila for Hong Kong. His powerful enemies refused to give him peace and quiet. Anonymous letters with threats on his life were sent to his parents' house in Calamba. Then, on February 8, 1888, Rizal arrived in Hong Kong and he was welcomed by Filipino residents. While in Hong Kong, Rizal engaged in cultural activities. Among the experiences while he observed were the Chinese way of celebrating their New Year. He also managed to visit different churches and cemeteries that were owned by Catholics, Protestants, and Muslims. On February 18 to 21, 1888, Rizal also visited Macau, a Portuguese colony near Hong Kong. He was invited to stay at the residence of Don Francisco Lecaros, who was a former Filipino delegate to the Spanish Cortes. For 2 days, Rizal enjoyed being a tourist and visited different cultural places which include churches, botanical gardens, theaters, and the Macau Casino. Lastly, on February 22, 1888, Rizal left Hong Kong because his next destination was in Japan. Jose Rizal and Josephine Bracken met in Hong Kong when Josephine accompanied her blind adoptive father, George Topher. It is to see Rizal because he is a respected ophthalmologist for his failing eyesight. Rizal and Bracken fell in love, considering it as love at first sight, and got married within a month, which Topher hardly agreed upon.
Among the happiest moments of Rizal in his life was his sojourn in the land of the cherry blossoms. He stayed in Japan for 1 month and a half from February 28 from April 13, 1888. He was charmed by the nature beauty of Japan, the manners of Japanese people, and the pictures. He also fell in love with a Japanese girl whose loveliness infused joy and romance in his sorrowing heart. After his arrival in Tokyo, Rizal was visited by Juan Perez Cavalerio, Secretary of Spanish Legation. Rizal knew that his was the Spanish government's way of monitoring Rizal, but he accepted anyways. On March 7, he moved out of Tokyo Hotel and lived at the Spanish legation. He and Perez Cavalerio became good friends and described him as a young, fine, and an excellent writer. During his first day in Tokyo, Rizal could not speak the Japanese language. He had a hard time for shopping, for he could not be understood and children laughed at him. With his situation, Rizal decided to study the Japanese language. He was able to speak within a few days. At Japan, he studied the Japanese drama, arts, music, and he also visited museums, libraries, arts, galleries, and shrines. Rizal met a pretty Japanese girl. Osei-san's beauty and affections almost tempted Rizal to settle down in Japan. At the same time, he was offered a good job by the Spanish legations, but then his love for the fatherland and his mission to free his oppressed people made him think again. Rizal's great love for Seiko and Japan will be memories that he will always cherish, but it was his time to go. On April 13, 1888, Rizal boarded the Belgique, an English steamer, at Yokohama, bound for the United States. He left Japan with a heavy heart, for he knew that he will never see this beautiful land again. So as his beloved Osei-san, his sojourn in Japan for 45 days was one of the happiest of his life.
In 1888, Dr. Jose Rizal made his first visit to the United States. His journey began on April 28 when he arrived in San Francisco aboard the steamer Belgique. Upon arrival, Rizal and the other passengers were detained on board for a week due to supposed cholera epidemic. Rizal suspected that this quarantine was politically motivated, particularly in light of the anti-Chinese sentiment and the Enforcement of Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was prevalent at this time. On May 4, 1888, after a week of confinement, Rizal was finally allowed to go ashore. He registered at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco where he paid $4 for lodging. He stayed there until May 6 before beginning his transcontinental journey across the United States. On May 6, Rizal traveled from Oakland to Port Costa, taking a train to Benicia. He had a dinner in Sacramento and spent the night on a couch in the train. The following day, he had a breakfast in Reno, Nevada, costing him 75 cents. Reno, already glamorized as the biggest little city in the world, presented a barren landscape of sand and bare mountains, a stark contrast to the tropical environment Rizal was accustomed to. predominance of women in restaurants. He admired the snow-escaped mountains in the distance, which reminded him the Talim Island near his hometown. As a train moved from Ogden to Denver, he noted the changing time zones as a sparse yet striking landscapes. On May 9, Rizal woke up in Colorado, where he remarked on the presence of more trees compared to the previous days. He also experienced an uncanny encounter with a porter on the Pullman car. By May 10, Rizal was in Nebraska, describing it as a plain state. In Omaha, he marveled the Missouri River, comparing it to the Pasig River in the Philippines. On May 11, Rizal reached Chicago. Although he did not stay long, he observed the unique way tobacco shop advertised, with statues of Native Americans, each different from the next. On the following day, Rizal visited the Niagara Falls from the Canadian side. While impressed by the grandeur, he compared it to the falls of Los Baños, finding the latter more beautiful despite Niagara's imposing size. On May 13, Rizal arrived in Albany, New York, and admired the beauty of the Hudson River. His transcontinental journey concluded in New York City, where he stayed at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. On May 16, 1888, Rizal departed at the United States aboard the City of Rome, bound for Liverpool, England. As the ship sailed past the Statue of Liberty, Rizal's brief but eventful American journey came to an end.
After visiting the United States, Dr. Jose Rizal lived in London from May 1888 to March 1889. He chose the English city to be his new home for three reasons. First, to improve his knowledge of the English language. Second, to study and annotate Morga's successos de las Islas Filipinas. And lastly, London was a safe place for him to carry on his fight against Spanish tyranny. From the USA, he arrived in the Liverpool, England by SS City of Rome. He stayed at Adelphi Hotel. By train, he arrived at London, and he stopped at Grand Hotel Midland. He temporarily stayed as a guest at the home of Dr. Antonio Maria Regidor, an 1872 exile and a practicing lawyer. He transferred to a private home in number 37 Chalcot Crescent, Primrose Hill, owned by the Beckett family, which was near to the British Museum. The greatest achievement of Rizal in London was the annotating of Morga's book Successos de las Islas Filipinas, which was published in Mexico 1609. He spent many days in the reading room of the British Museum, poring over the pages of this book, and laboriously reading the old histories of the Philippines, such as those written by Father Chirino, Father Colin, Father Argensola, Father Plasencia, and etc. Of all written histories published during the early years of the Spanish regime, that of Dr. Morga was, in his considered opinion, the best.
Brussels, 1890. January 28, 1890, Rizal left Paris to Brussels. Brussels is the capital city of Belgium. Reasons why Rizal left Paris is because of the costly living of Paris due to international exposition. The gay social life in Paris may hampered his literary works for his second novel, El Filibusterismo. Life in Brussels. Jose Albert accompanied Rizal when he moved to Brussels and lived a modest life in boarding house. Jose Alejandrino, an engineering student who replaced Jose Albert after he left the city. Rizal's articles in La Solidaridad, La Verdad para Dos, The Truth for All, in May 31, 1889, his first article written in La Solidaridad. Second, Verdades Nuevas, New Truths in July 31, 1889. Una Profanation, A Profanation, in July 31, 1889. Meeting attack against the friars for refusing to bury Mariano Hermosa in the Catholic cemetery because he was a brother-in-law of Rizal. Fourth,
Diferencias or Differences in September 15, 1889. Fifth, Filipina dentro de 100 años or The Philippines a Century Hence. Published serially on September 30, October 31, December 15, 1889, and February 1, 1890. A prophecy that someday the Filipinos will rise in revolution against Spain and win their independence, but later the Philippines shall come under the rule of the United States. Sixth, Ingratitude or Ingratitude. January 15, 1890, a reply to the Governor General Weyler, who says to the people of Laguna Province should not let themselves to be deceived by the vain promises of the underground sons. Event Sin Nombre or Without Name in February 28, 1890. 8. Sobre la Nueva Ortografía de la Lingua Tagala or on the new orthography of the Tagalog language in April 15, 1890. Advocating the use of new spelling in Tagalog. Cosas de Filipinas or Things About the Philippines in April 30, 1890. And last but not the least, Sobre la Indolencia de los Filipinos or The Indolence of the Filipinos. In July 15, September 15, 1890, a brilliant essay in defense of the Filipinos' indolence.
Romance with Suzanne Jacobi, the petite niece of his landladies. Like any other woman, Suzanne fell in love with Rizal. She cried when he left toward the end of July 1890 for Madrid.